Seongmin Ryu leaned back in his chair, swirled his wine glass, and laughed. Not a polite laugh, not even a dismissive one. A slow, deliberate laugh, the kind a man releases when he wants everyone at the table to understand exactly where his contempt is aimed. "The dogs are quiet," Nia had said. Quietly. Carefully. The way she always said things in this house, because she had learned that saying them loudly only gave them more ammunition. "Yes," Seongmin replied, setting down his glass with theatrical patience. "Because dogs, unlike some people at this table, know when they are not needed." Several men laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Daejin said nothing. And that silence, that specific silence, was the moment Nia Calder Ryu understood that no matter what happened next, she was completely alone in this room. If that were you, if everyone at the table laughed while your husband looked away, what would you do? If this kind of story moves you, please subscribe to this channel and follow Nia's story all the way to the end, because what she does next will stay with you. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The dinner had been Daejin's idea. Not a celebration exactly, more of a demonstration. Every 6 months or so, he gathered his senior people under one roof, his uncle Seongmin, his security chief Kellen Voss, his 3 regional lieutenants, and a rotating cast of advisors whose names Nia had stopped trying to memorize. And he let them eat well and drink well and speak freely. It was, he had once explained to her, the way his father had done it, the way his grandfather had done it before that. A show of unity, a reminder that the organization was a family. Nia had learned very early in this marriage not to point out the obvious contradictions in that particular framing. She had dressed carefully that evening, not because she wanted to impress anyone. She had given up on that particular project sometime in the middle of their 2nd year of marriage, but because she understood that how she presented herself was the only language this room consistently paid attention to. A black woman at a table full of Korean men in expensive suits, in a house that had never quite decided whether she belonged in it. She had learned to armor herself with composure the way other people armored themselves with weapons. Slowly, deliberately, until it sat on her like a second skin. The estate sat about 40 minutes outside Chicago, tucked behind a tree line that made it invisible from the road. Daejin had bought it 5 years before they married, and he loved it with a quietness that surprised her. This hard, controlled man who touched the wooden banister every time he descended the stairs, who stood at the kitchen window in the mornings watching the birds, who seemed, in this specific house, more like a person and less like a role. That was the version of him she had married. She reminded herself of that sometimes, when the other version became difficult to reach. Rain had been falling since late afternoon, and by the time dinner was served, it had become a proper storm, the kind that hammers glass and turns the world outside into streaks of black and silver. The dining room glowed warm against it. Crystal caught the candlelight. Conversation moved the way it always moved in this company, in layers, nothing fully said, everything fully understood. Nia ate and watched and said very little. This was not unusual. She had long since stopped fighting for a seat at the conversational table. Her presence was tolerated as an extension of Daejin's authority, which meant she was addressed when necessary and otherwise treated as a very elegant piece of furniture. Seongmin was particularly skilled at this, at looking through her mid-sentence, at redirecting his answers toward Daejin even when she had asked the question, at deploying a specific smile that managed to be both courteous and completely withering. She had once asked Daejin whether he noticed. He had said, "Seongmin is old-fashioned. He means nothing by it." She had said, "Old-fashioned is a choice, Daejin. Every single morning, it is a choice." He had not known what to say to that, and eventually the conversation had drifted elsewhere the way conversations in their marriage sometimes did. Not resolved, just quietly set aside, like dishes left to soak. That was 40 minutes into dinner. By the time the second course arrived, Nia had already begun noticing things she could not explain. The first was small, almost nothing. One of the exterior security cameras, she could see its little green status light reflected in the rain-dark glass of the window behind Seongmin's head, had been blinking at irregular intervals for the last 10 minutes. Now it wasn't blinking at all. The light was steady. Cameras on this system blinked when actively recording. A steady light meant something else entirely. She looked at Kellen. Kellen was cutting his steak. She looked at the window again, scanning the edges of the reflection carefully, the way she had once trained herself to scan the perimeter of a building without appearing to look directly at it. This was an old habit, one she had not exercised in years, one she had not needed to exercise in years because she had left that life behind deliberately, gratefully, permanently, or so she had believed. The second thing she noticed was the dogs. There were 4 of them. German shepherds, trained security animals, not pets. During every previous dinner she had attended at this estate, the dogs were present somewhere in the background. The occasional bark, the sound of claws on the stone floor of the adjacent corridor, as one of the handlers moved them through their patrol route. Background noise. So consistent she usually stopped hearing it entirely. For the last 7 minutes, there had been nothing. Not quiet. Silence. A specific, total kind of silence that every person who has ever worked in a dangerous environment learns to recognize the same way they learn to recognize smoke. Not with logic, but with the body, in the chest, before the brain catches up. She set down her fork, leaned slightly toward Dae-jin. "We need to leave," she said, quietly. Just for him. He looked at her. His expression was the careful, unrevealing expression he wore in professional settings. Not cold exactly, but managed. "We're in the middle of—" "The camera behind Seong-min has stopped recording," she said. "The dogs have been silent for at least 7 minutes. There's something in the reflection of the window that shouldn't be there." Dae-jin looked at the window, saw nothing, because he had not been taught to look the way she had been taught to look. "Nia, we need to leave." Slightly less quiet now. Seong-min had turned, the way Seong-min always turned when her voice entered the conversation. Not toward her precisely, but with the posture of a man performing patience. "Is something wrong?" he asked, directing the question at Dae-jin as though Nia had not spoken at all. "Nia thinks—" "There is someone outside," Nia said, clearly, directly, to the table. The room went still for a moment. Then Seong-min laughed. That slow, deliberate laugh. Every man at the table receiving it, deciding how to align themselves, the way men in rooms like this always silently decided how to align themselves based on whoever laughed first. "The estate has 12 armed personnel," Seong-min said pleasantly. "A perimeter system, guard dogs, and a security chief whose entire salary is devoted to ensuring evenings like this remain." "The dogs are quiet," Nia said. "Yes," Seong-min replied, picking up his wine glass. "Because dogs, unlike some people at this table, know when they are not needed." Several men laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Dae-jin said nothing. 3 seconds, 5 seconds. Long enough for Nia to understand exactly what his silence meant. She looked at her husband. He met her eyes, and she saw it there. Not cruelty, not agreement with his uncle. Something more complicated and in some ways more painful. She saw a man caught between what he believed and what was convenient to believe. A man who had spent 3 years being gently, consistently told that his wife's instincts were anxiety rather than intelligence, and who had, over time, found it easier to accept that narrative than to examine it. She had spent 3 years watching him make that choice. She had never found a way to make it stop hurting. "All right," she said. She picked up her fork. She took one more bite, set the fork down, dabbed her mouth with the linen napkin, folded it, and placed it on the table with the precision of someone who was not, in any way, finished with this conversation, only setting it aside temporarily. The lights went out 40 seconds later. Not a flicker, not a gradual dimming, a complete instantaneous cut, the kind that only happens when the primary power and the backup are taken simultaneously, which is not something that happens by accident and which requires knowledge of the estate's electrical infrastructure that should have been impossible for an outsider to possess. In the absolute dark, Nia was already out of her chair, not panicking, not fumbling, moving with the kind of quiet, efficient decisiveness that comes not from training alone, but from the specific experience of having been in a dark room when things went very, very wrong, and having survived it, and having carried that survival in her body ever since. She had her hand on Dae-jin's arm before he had fully registered what happened. "Don't stand up," she said into his ear. "Don't call out. Move left along the wall, on my shoulder. Now." "Nia, what?" "Now, Dae-jin." He moved. Several of the other men had not moved. Several of them were standing, reaching for phones, calling for Kellen, calling for their security teams, making themselves loud and visible in a dark room, which is the last thing you want to do when you don't yet know how many people are outside or what they're carrying. Kellen's voice cut through the confusion from somewhere across the room. Everyone stay calm. This is a system fault. We have a beat, a pause with a particular quality. We have a situation. All personnel report to Kellen, Nia said. Mrs. Ryu, please. The south corridor is compromised. She said it flatly, with the quiet certainty of someone who has been reading the situation for the last 15 minutes while everyone else was finishing their steak. Whatever your evacuation protocol routes through the south corridor, change it, right now. A silence. That is a secure route, Kellen said, carefully. With the particular careful tone of a man who does not want to openly argue with the boss's wife in front of witnesses, but absolutely intends to continue not listening to her. It has been swept twice today. It was swept by personnel whose communications have been compromised for at least 40 minutes, Nia said. The camera behind the east window went static before anyone outside this room should have known we were sitting down to dinner, which means someone in this room told them we were sitting down to dinner. The south corridor is where they want us to go. Another silence, a different quality to this one, because in this silence, several of the men around the table, men who had spent 3 years treating her like a decorative inconvenience, were doing the quiet, involuntary math of people suddenly unsure about what they thought they knew. Dejin's hand found hers in the dark. She did not pull away, but she did not hold on either. Not yet. There was too much to do. From outside now, muffled by the rain but unmistakable once you knew what you were listening for, came the sound of coordinated movement, multiple people, moving in formation, not guards on a routine patrol, people who knew exactly where they were going. Kellen started to repeat his order about the south corridor evacuation route. One of the kitchen staff burst through the service door at the back of the dining room, breathing hard. They're inside, she said. 3 of them came through the service entrance. Chen isn't... She stopped. Couldn't finish it. Nobody needed her to. The sound of the rain against the windows seemed suddenly very loud. Nia felt Dejin's grip on her hand tighten. She looked at him, or at the shape of him in the darkness, the warmth of him in the room. You should have listened, she said, very quietly. Not unkind, just honest. Then she let go of his hand, turned toward the kitchen staff member who was still standing in the doorway, hyperventilating, and said, How many came through the service entrance? And where did you come from when you ran? Because there were people in this room who might still be alive in an hour if someone made the right decisions in the next 30 seconds. And it was increasingly, undeniably clear that the someone was going to have to be her. She didn't want it. She had never wanted it. She had left this behind. The quick breathing and the dark rooms and the terrible arithmetic of keeping people alive. Because she was tired. Because she had wanted something quieter. Something that was just hers. But wanting something different than what is in front of you does not change what is in front of you. And what was in front of her was a dark room, a husband who had taken too long to believe her, a table full of men who had spent 3 years learning to disregard her, and somewhere in the walls of this beautiful estate that she had never quite been allowed to call home, a team of professional killers who had been given every advantage they needed by someone sitting at the same dinner table where she had just been laughed at. Nia Calder Ryu took a breath, slow, even, all the way in. Tell me, she said to the trembling kitchen worker, exactly what you saw. And the night, long, violent, and irreversible, truly began. The kitchen worker's name was Yuna. She was 23 years old, had worked at the estate for 11 months, and right now she was pressing herself against the doorframe with both hands shaking and her breath coming in these short, wet bursts that Nia recognized immediately. Not hysterics, not weakness, but the body's honest response to having seen something it could not unfeel. Nia crossed the room to her in 4 steps. Not running, moving with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, because she understood that in a room full of frightened people, the person who moves without panic becomes the person everyone else anchors to, and right now this room needed an anchor badly. She put one hand on Yuna's shoulder, firm, not gentle in a soft way, firm in the way that says, I am here, stay with me. Look at me, Nia said quietly, just at me. How many came through the service entrance? Yuna's eyes found hers. 3. maybe 4. They had they had things on their faces. And Chen, he tried to... She stopped again. Did you see which direction they moved after they came through? Toward the east stairwell? Nia filed that immediately. The east stairwell connected to the secondary corridor, which fed into the main gallery, the room that sat directly between the dining hall and the estate's central hub. It was, she noted with a cold clarity, exactly the position you would want to hold if your goal was to cut the dining room off from the rest of the building while steering survivors toward the south corridor. Exactly where she had told Kellen they were being steered. She turned. Kellen was on his radio, and even in the dark she could read his posture the way she had learned to read everything in this house. The tight shoulders, the angle of his jaw, the specific way he held the radio slightly away from his body when he wasn't getting a response from the other end. He wasn't getting a response. Kellen, she said, I'm trying to reach the outer perimeter. They've cut your communications. You know that already. She kept her voice level, not accusing, just naming the reality both of them could see clearly. How many of your men inside the building are you certain of? A pause. The kind of pause that contains a man arguing with himself. 4, he said finally. Possibly 5. The rest were stationed outside or along the east stairwell is blocked. South corridor is a kill box, which means the only viable route right now is through the wine cellar access off the kitchen, north through the utility passage, and into the main garage. She watched him. You know this building's layout. You know I'm right. Kellen straightened, not in agreement, in something more complicated. A man whose professional authority had just been navigated around by someone he had spent 3 years deciding wasn't worth listening to, and who was not yet ready to admit in front of witnesses that this recalibration was necessary. Mrs. Ryu, he said, carefully. The way you say a name when you're using it as a substitute for something less polite. I appreciate your... Kellen, Dajin's voice came from across the room. Quiet, but with an edge in it that Nia had rarely heard him deploy inside this house. She was right about the camera. She was right about the dogs. She was right about the south corridor before any of your people flagged it. A beat. So I need you to stop performing and start listening. Silence. A long, complicated silence. Kellen's jaw worked once. Then he said, The utility passage access panel requires a code I don't have. I have it, Nia said. Another silence. Different quality. Because everyone in the room was now doing math. Everyone was asking the same question without asking it out loud. Why does the boss's wife have access codes that the head of security doesn't? And the answer to that question, which none of them had ever been particularly curious about before tonight, was simple. Dajin had given them to her 18 months ago, after a weekend when a pipe had burst in the utility corridor and the emergency maintenance team had needed access, and Dajin had been in Seoul and Kellan had been unavailable, and the only person on the property who could authorize entry had been Nia. It had been a practical decision, not a strategic one. Tonight it was the difference between a route and no route. Then let's move, Dajin said. Seungmin, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since the lights went out, spoke from somewhere near the far end of the table. We should wait for the outer security team to reestablish contact. Moving through the building without full intelligence on the attackers' positions is... Seungmin, Dajin's voice, flat. Do not. A pause. I'm simply suggesting, Seungmin said, and even now, even in the dark with killers somewhere in the walls, his voice held that particular texture of a man accustomed to being the most credible person in any room he entered, that decisions of this magnitude should not be driven by... By what? Nia said. She had not planned to say it, or maybe she had. Maybe she had been holding it in a specific pocket of herself for 3 years, and it had finally reached the surface because there was no longer any reason to manage it. Finish it, she said. Say it. Right now, tonight, with men with guns in this building. Say what you were going to say. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. Seungmin did not finish the sentence. Nia turned away from him. Not because she was backing down, because there was nothing left in that direction worth the time. Yuna, she said, stay behind me. You do exactly what I do, you move when I move, and if I tell you to get flat, you get flat immediately without asking why. Understand? Yuna nodded. The rest of you... Nia looked around the room, at the lieutenants, at the two advisors who had been at dinner, at the remaining members of the serving staff who had come in from the kitchen. 7 people total, plus Daejin and Seong-min. Stay in a line. No one moves independently. No one calls out. No lights on your phones. She looked at the advisor nearest the door, a broad-shouldered man named Park, who she knew was carrying. Park, you're at the back of the line. Anyone comes through a door behind us that isn't one of ours, you don't hesitate. Park looked at Daejin. Daejin looked at Park. Do what she says, Daejin said. They moved. The kitchen was 30 feet from the dining room, and crossing it was the first real test of whether this group could function as a unit or whether it would collapse into individual panic the moment pressure was applied. It was dark. It was unfamiliar terrain for most of them. Somewhere deeper in the building there was a sound. Not a shot, not a shout, something blunter and shorter, the kind of sound that ends things. And 2 of the lieutenants flinched and nearly broke formation. Hold, Nia said, barely above a whisper. Hold. They held. She found the access panel in the kitchen's back wall by feel, running her fingers along the painted surface until the slightly recessed edge of the panel met her fingertips. The keypad was dead. No power. But the panel itself had a manual override, a small physical cylinder lock beneath the faceplate that she had noticed exactly once, 18 months ago, in passing, and had filed away the way she filed everything, without knowing why, without knowing if it would ever be useful. She had a key for it on her keychain. The keychain that Daejin had given her with the estate keys when they married. The keychain that she had carried every time she came to this estate, that she had clipped to her evening bag tonight out of habit, that she had nearly left behind 3 different times because who brings estate keys to a formal dinner? She brought it to the lock. Her hand was not perfectly steady. She wanted to be honest about that, not to herself in some heroic internal monologue, but in the specific physical way that honesty lives in the body, in the slight tremor she felt and acknowledged and breathed through without letting it stop her. The lock turned. The panel opened. The utility passage beyond it was low-ceilinged and smelled of concrete and old pipe insulation and something faintly metallic, and it was dark in the absolute way that spaces without windows are dark, and Nia went in first. The group moved through the passage in single file. The only sounds were breathing and the careful placement of feet and the distant percussion of rain against the building's shell somewhere above them. Nobody spoke. Even Seong-min did not speak, which Nia noted without commentary. They were roughly halfway through the passage when Kellen touched her elbow. She stopped. He leaned close enough that she could feel his breath near her ear. "There's something you should know," he said. So quiet it was nearly inaudible. "About the camera that went static." She waited. "It went static at 6:42, he said. She ran the math. Dinner had started at 6:30. The camera had lost signal 12 minutes into the meal. "You knew," she said, not a question. "I flagged it as a possible system fault. I was going to send someone to check after dinner." "Kellen." "I know." "You flagged a camera failure in the middle of a senior organization dinner as a possible system fault," she said. Still barely a whisper, still flat. "And you were going to check after dinner." "I didn't think—" "No." She turned back to the passage and kept moving. "You didn't." She heard him fall back into line behind her. She heard the particular quality of his silence, the silence of a person calculating the distance between a decision they made and the consequences currently surrounding them on all sides. She had no interest in making him feel worse about it than he already felt. That wasn't what this was. But she also had no interest in softening it. The utility passage ended at a heavy fire door that opened into the estate's main garage. 4 vehicles, overhead doors, the smell of oil and cold concrete. Nia put her hand against the door and felt nothing alarming, no vibration, no shadow under the gap at the bottom, suggesting a light source on the other side. She opened it slowly. The garage was empty. The group filed in. Someone exhaled in relief. Nia did not exhale in relief because the garage's overhead doors were closed, and she did not yet know whether the exterior was clear. And relief is the precise moment when people stop paying attention, and stopped attention gets people killed. "The vehicles," Daejin said, moving toward the nearest car. "Wait," Nia said. He stopped. Something in how quickly he stopped told her that the last 20 minutes had genuinely rearranged something in him. The man who had hesitated at the dinner table, who had looked at her warnings and chosen his uncle's comfortable laugh over her uncomfortable truth, had gone somewhere, and in his place was a man who was, for the first time in a long time, actually listening. It was the thing she had wanted. For 3 years. She did not have time to feel anything about it right now. The doors are power operated, she said. If they've cut the main power and the backup, the doors don't open on remote. There's a manual release. She scanned the garage, found the red handle on the nearest door. There. But the moment that door goes up, we're visible from the outside and we don't know what's waiting out there. So we're trapped, one of the lieutenants said. A man named Doe, heavyset, with the particular aggressive energy of someone whose fear was converting directly to anger because anger felt more manageable. We come down here and we're just in a different box. We're in a box with vehicles in a defensible position and one entry point, Nia said. That's better than where we were. Better, Doe repeated, with a specific inflection that she recognized very well. The inflection of a man who needed someone to blame and was auditioning candidates. Dope, Dejin said. She's been running us around this building like we're... Doe. Harder. Doe stopped, looked at the floor. The anger didn't go away. It just went underground, which was, Nia reflected, where it had always lived in men like this. She was checking the garage's small side window, set high in the wall, narrow, just enough to see a slice of the estate's north exterior, when she heard it. Not a sound. An absence of sound. The rain had been constant for hours, and now it had shifted, lightened slightly. And in that slight easing she could hear, just barely, footsteps. 2 sets. Moving along the exterior north wall. They weren't random. They were searching. Down, she said. The group went down. 7 people finding cover behind vehicles and concrete support pillars with varying degrees of grace and a fair amount of suppressed panic, and Nia pressed herself against the wall beneath the window and did not breathe and listened. The footsteps passed, slowed, stopped. 14 seconds in which nobody in the garage made a single sound, and Nia was genuinely proud of them for that. Even Doe, even Seongmin, who was crouched behind the rear wheel of the nearest SUV looking, for the first time in the years she had known him, like something other than the most powerful person in the vicinity. The footsteps moved on. The group slowly, carefully came back upright, and that was when Dejin's phone vibrated. He looked at it. His face changed. A complex, rapid sequence of changes, confusion, then recognition, then something colder and more careful. He turned the screen so Nia could read it without the light carrying too far. It was a message. Anonymous number, 4 words, send her out alone. Nia looked at the message for a long moment. Then she looked up at the group, at the 7 people who had followed her through a dark passage, at Kellen, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, at Park, who was still at the rear and had not put his weapon away, at Seongmin, who was watching Dejin's phone from across the garage with an expression that gave nothing away, which was, she had learned, Seongmin's expression when something was happening that he already knew about. She looked at Seongmin. He looked back at her. And in that specific exchange, 3 seconds, 4, she understood something that she could not yet prove, but that her body registered with a cold, settling certainty that moved through her like ice water. He was not surprised by the message. He was waiting to see what she would do about it. Anonymous number, she said to Dejin, still very quiet. Sent to your private line. She watched him process it. How many people have that number, Dejin? He said nothing. How many people in this room have that number? The garage was very quiet. Dejin looked at the message, looked at the group, looked at his uncle. Seongmin spread his hands in a small, patient gesture. Dejina, you're exhausted. Don't read into... I'm not reading into anything, Dejin said. It was the quietest she had ever heard him speak. Quieter than anger, quieter than grief. The quiet of a man standing at the edge of something he cannot come back from once he looks at it directly. Nia did not push him. She had been pushing for 3 years and had learned the hard way that pushed men either move or fall, and right now she needed Dejin on his feet. Instead, she crossed the garage to the nearest vehicle, an SUV, 2 years old, all-wheel drive. She ran her hand along the undercarriage near the rear wheel well, found what she was looking for. A small magnetic case, the kind that contains a spare key, the kind that every estate manager puts in the same predictable location because estate managers are practical people who do not vary their habits. The key was there. She held it up so Daejin could see it. "Here is what we are going to do," she said. Not loudly, but with a precision and a finality that ended the ambient noise of 7 frightened people organizing themselves around competing impulses. Park takes the east position. Kellen, you and Do are on the door. Manual release, slow lift, 2 feet of clearance. You check the exterior before it opens any further. She looked at the remaining staff. You 3 are in the vehicle. Middle seats, down as far as you can go. She looked at Daejin. You're in the passenger seat. She looked at Seongmin last. You're in the back, center seat. Seongmin's expression shifted. Almost nothing. A fraction. But she had been studying this man's face for 3 years, cataloging every micro-expression the way you catalog the terrain of a place you have learned you cannot entirely trust, and she saw it. "That's not necessary," he said. "I can ride with—" "I know," Nia said. "Center seat." A beat. "Is there something you'd like to say to me, Seongmin?" she asked. The garage was so quiet that the sound of rain felt loud. He looked at her with the full weight of 3 years of disdain. Disdain she had been absorbing and metabolizing and carrying in her chest like ballast. And he said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Kellen and Do moved to the door. Park moved to his position. And that was when the lights came back on. Not the estate's main lights. Something specific. The garage's own lighting system, which ran on a separate circuit, and which should have been non-functional because the main power was cut and the backup was down. The lights came on because someone had manually restored the garage circuit from the estate's secondary utility panel. The secondary utility panel that only 3 people on the property had access to. One of them was Daejin, one was Kellen, and the third was the estate's head of internal systems, a man named Byun, who had worked for Seongmin for 11 years before Daejin had absorbed him into the organization when he and Seongmin merged their operations. Byun, who was not at the dinner tonight. Byun, who had been on the property since that morning, overseeing what had been described to Daejin as a routine systems maintenance review. Nia looked at the garage lights. She looked at Seongmin. She thought about the camera that went static 12 minutes into dinner. She thought about the coordinated timing of the power cut. She thought about the fact that the attackers had moved immediately and with total confidence toward positions that should have been unknown to them, toward corridors and access points that only someone with detailed interior knowledge could have identified. She thought about the anonymous message sent to a private number. She thought about how many times in 3 years she had said something is wrong and been laughed at by this specific man. She looked at Seongmin and she understood, with the full, terrible clarity of someone who has just seen a picture resolve from blurred to sharp, exactly what had been constructed around her husband and who had constructed it and how long it had been in place. Daejin was watching her face. "Nia," he said, low, private. The way he said her name when there was no performance in it, no management, just him. She looked at him. She wanted to say something. There was a great deal she wanted to say, had wanted to say for a long time, a backlog of truth that had been sitting behind every careful dinner and every swallowed word, and every time she had watched his face choose convenience over her. What she said was, "Don't let him out of your sight." And then the garage's exterior door, the one Kellen and Do had not yet opened, the one on the building's west face, began, slowly and with the mechanical certainty of a powered system, to rise. Someone was opening it from the outside, someone who knew the override code. Nia was already moving. The door rose 6 inches before Nia reached the manual release on the interior wall and hit the emergency lock. The mechanism engaged with a sound like a gunshot, a hard metallic clunk that echoed off the concrete walls, and the door stopped moving. Whoever was on the other side had the override code. They did not have the interior emergency lock, because the interior emergency lock was a physical deadbolt that had been installed as an afterthought, a recommendation from an insurance assessor 2 years ago that Kellen had implemented without particular enthusiasm, and that nobody had thought about since. Nia had thought about it. She thought about everything in this building, because thinking about everything in this building was what you did when the building was your primary residence but had never quite decided to accept you, when you spent long afternoons and longer evenings moving through its rooms while the people who owned it were elsewhere, when you had nothing to do but notice things. Noticing things had kept her alive in worse places than this. The door shuddered. One hard impact from the outside, testing the lock. Then a second. Then nothing. They were regrouping. That bought us maybe 3 minutes, Nia said, already moving back toward the group. Maybe less if they have a cutter. Doe was breathing through his nose in the rapid, shallow way of a man fighting to keep himself from doing something impulsive. We can't stay in here. We can't go through the building. And now we can't go out the west door. He looked at Nia with the specific expression of a man who has decided that the problem and the person responsible for the problem are the same thing. So what exactly is your plan? DOH, Kellen said. No, I want to hear it. She's been steering us this whole time, so I want to hear what... The roof access, Nia said. Silence. She pointed upward. Set into the garage ceiling directly above the second vehicle, a detail she had registered 18 months ago and never needed until now, was a utility hatch. A square of slightly different colored concrete, a folding ladder mounted to the wall beside it, the kind of access point that maintenance workers use to inspect roofing infrastructure and that everybody else forgets exists approximately 30 seconds after they see it. That puts us on the roof, Park said, from his position near the east wall. His voice was careful, the voice of a man running scenarios. In the rain, with no visibility. With high ground, Nia said, with sightlines on 3 sides of the building, with a route to the communications antenna on the north face, which runs on its own independent power cell, and a direct visual on the estate's outer gate. She looked at Park. From up there we can see who's outside and where they're positioned. We can signal the outer road, and we can stop moving blind. A pause. She's right, Kellen said. And this time there was no caveat in it, no management, no performance of professional dignity. Just 2 words from a man who had spent the last 40 minutes watching the consequence of not saying them sooner. Then we move, Daejin said. Seongmin had not spoken since the door began to rise. He was standing slightly apart from the group, near the rear of the furthest vehicle, and Nia had been tracking him in her peripheral vision the entire time. The particular constant attention she would have given to an unsecured exit or an unknown structural element, something that needed monitoring because its behavior was not fully predictable. He looked calm. That was the thing that troubled her most. Everyone in this garage was running at some level of visible fear. Doe's anger, which was fear wearing a different coat. Kellen's tightened jaw. The kitchen staff clustered together with their arms crossed over their own bodies, the unconscious, self-protective geometry of frightened people. Yuna, who was doing better than most of them, but whose hands still had a faint, persistent tremor that she kept pressing against her thighs. Seongmin looked calm, the way a man looks calm when the outcome of events is not a surprise to him. Nia pulled the folding ladder down from the wall. It telescoped with a series of clicking joints, and she tested the lowest rung with her full weight before she gestured for Yuna to start climbing. Yuna went up, then 2 of the kitchen staff, then Park, who needed to be above them before she could move people through the hatch without leaving the ground floor unmonitored. Seong-min, Nia said without turning around. You're next. I'm not as young as I used to be, he said, almost pleasantly. That ladder looks precarious. It'll hold you. She turned, looked at him directly. Go. Something moved behind his eyes. Not fear, something more deliberate, a calculation. He went to the ladder and began climbing with the careful movements of a man who was being cautious in a way that was also buying time. And Nia watched every step, and when he was halfway up, she turned to Daejin. When we get to the roof, she said, low and fast, I need you to stay close to me, and I need you to tell me, honestly, everything you know about Byun. Daejin's expression shifted. Byun. He's the one who restored the garage lighting. He had access to the secondary utility panel, and he was on this property all day under the cover of systems maintenance. She watched Daejin's face. How long has he worked for Seongmin specifically? Daejin said nothing for a moment, then, before the merger, 11 years. And after the merger? He transitioned to my systems team. He works for Kellen now, technically, but Seongmin, he stopped. Seongmin what? Seongmin recommended I keep him on, said he was indispensable for the estate's infrastructure. Daejin's voice had gone very quiet, the quietness of a man disassembling something he built and discovering, piece by piece, that none of the joints were what he thought they were. He said it would be wasteful to let him go just because of the reorganization. Nia absorbed this without expression. How many other people in this organization came with Seongmin's personal recommendation? She asked. Daejin looked at her. She could see him doing the count. She could see the number arriving in his face before he said it, could see what that number meant to him, could see the specific quality of understanding that looks, at first, almost exactly like disbelief. Later, she said, because the door on the west wall had just shuttered again, harder this time, and 3 minutes had almost certainly elapsed. Roof. Now. They went up. The roof of the estate's garage was a flat expanse of waterproofed concrete that connected, via a low-maintenance walkway, to the sloped main structure of the house. The rain had not let up. If anything, it had intensified, and it hit them immediately. Cold, lateral, driven by a wind that had picked up in the last hour and that turned the estate's tree line into a continuous restless motion that made every shadow ambiguous. Nia came up last. She counted heads the moment she cleared the hatch. 11 people, everyone accounted for. She pulled the hatch shut behind her and looked for something to brace it. Found a section of metal conduit near the antenna housing, threaded it through the hatch's external handle. Not enough to stop a determined entry, but enough to give a few seconds of warning. She oriented herself. North face. The communications antenna was there, mounted to a low concrete block. A cellular repeater that Daejin had installed for range extension, which ran, as she had told the garage, on its own dedicated power cell. She crossed to it, found the manual interface panel on the antenna's base housing. The interface was designed for a technician with a code. She didn't have the code. She had, however, worked in environments where communication systems were either the most important resource or the primary target, and she had learned in those environments a number of things about cellular repeaters that were not in any manufacturer's manual. She opened the housing panel with her key, the same estate key that had opened the utility passage, because the estate's facilities manager had made the practical if deeply inadvisable decision to use a universal key system for all non-primary access points, and looked at the internal components. Park appeared at her shoulder. Can you get it working? I can get a signal out, one transmission maybe. After that, if they're monitoring frequencies, they'll locate the source. She looked at Park. Do you have a contact outside this property who can receive an act? Park was quiet for a moment. Then, my second. He checks in every 40 minutes. If he doesn't hear from me, he moves. Last check-in? 22 minutes ago. 18 minutes. If she could get a signal out to Park's second, and if his second responded appropriately, there was potentially help coming in 18 minutes, possibly less, depending on position. This was not a plan. This was an arithmetic of hope, which was the best available material. 18 minutes, she said. Park looked at her. She looked back at the group arranged behind her on the rain-soaked roof. Yuna, with her arms wrapped around herself. Kellen scanning the estate grounds below with his weapon drawn, Do pacing a tight circuit near the hatch, Daejin standing very still and watching her with an expression she couldn't fully interpret in the dark and the rain, and Seongmin standing slightly behind Daejin with his hands in the pockets of his dinner jacket and his face turned partially away, watching the tree line. She went back to the antenna housing. She was 30 seconds into the bypass work when Yuna said, from her position near the roof's east edge, "There are more of them." Nia looked up. Yuna was looking down at the estate's main approach. 3 cars just came through the outer gate. They're moving fast. And the gate is open. Someone opened it from the inside. Kellen moved to the east edge, looked down. The outer gate code, he said. Who has the outer gate code? Byun, Nia said, without looking up from the antenna housing. And Seongmin. The word landed in the group like something dropped from a height. She heard Daejin turn. She heard the specific sound of several people all simultaneously reconsidering the geography of the roof and where they were standing relative to certain other people on it. She kept working on the antenna. Behind her, she heard Daejin say, Seongmin. One word, but with a texture that she had never heard from him before. A texture that had nothing managed in it, nothing performed. She heard Seongmin say, Daejina, you are under enormous stress right now, and stress makes people... The gate code, Daejin said. Who has the gate code? Many people have operational... Who has the gate code? Silence. She got the bypass wire seated correctly, and the antenna's signal relay flickered alive, a small amber light in the housing panel, unstable but present. She looked at Park. He was already reaching for his phone. 10 seconds, she told him. He looked at her, nodded, dialed. She held the bypass wire steady with both hands and felt the vibration of the relay through her fingers and listened to the rain and to Daejin's voice behind her going lower and more dangerous with every exchange. And she thought, 18 minutes. We need 18 minutes. Park's call connected. It lasted 9 seconds. Short enough to be under most detection thresholds. Long enough to say a location, a situation, and a number. He disconnected. Looked at Nia. He's moving. How far out? 12 minutes if he pushes. Better than 18. She released the bypass wire and closed the housing panel. Stood up and turned around. Daejin had closed the distance between himself and Seongmin, not touching him, but close. Close enough that Seongmin had shifted his weight almost imperceptibly toward the roof's north edge, and Nia registered that shift and moved without deciding to move, covering the distance at an angle that put her between Seongmin and the direction he was moving, because a man who feels cornered moves toward exit, and the north edge of this roof had a service ladder bolted to the building's exterior, and she was not going to let him reach it. He saw her move, and in seeing it he understood what it meant, that she had understood his intention before he had fully formed it, that she had, at some point in the last 3 years, been reading him as carefully as he had been dismissing her. His expression changed. It was a small change. Not much. But she had been cataloging this man's face for 3 years, and she saw it. Saw the moment where performance ended and something more genuine surfaced. Not panic, not guilt. Something harder and colder than either. Calculation. He had spent 3 years treating her as decoration. He had spent 3 years managing everyone else's perception of her, reinforcing the consensus that she was an outsider, a liability, a woman who had married above her worth and should have the good sense to stay quiet about it. He had done this slowly, consistently, because he understood that perception was the most durable weapon available, that you could change outcomes simply by changing what people were willing to believe. He had not, until this moment, adjusted his calculation for the possibility that she had been doing exactly the same thing to him. "You should tell him," Nia said. Not to Daejin, to Seongmin. The rain drove sideways between them. "Tell him what you arranged," she said. "All of it. How long the planning took. Who the outside team is. What the intended outcome looks like from your perspective." She paused. "Because in about 11 minutes, there are going to be people on this property who are not his and not yours, and when that happens, your leverage over this situation disappears completely. So the window where telling him yourself is better than having it extracted from you later is..." She checked nothing, because she did not need to check. Closing. Seongmin looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Daejin. And Daejin looked back at him with a face that had none of the hesitation in it that had lived there at the dinner table. None of the managed ambiguity that had been the texture of his expression every time Nia had brought something difficult to him, and he had let it slide. What was in Daejin's face now was simpler. "Talk," Daejin said. Another long pause. Then Seongmin said, almost conversationally, "You were going to take it somewhere it was never meant to go." Daejin said nothing. "Your father built this to survive," Seongmin said. "Your grandfather built it to survive. It was never supposed to be..." He paused, selected his words. "Restructured, reformed, turned into something clean and presentable for people who spent their whole lives looking down at us." His voice was steady, not apologetic. "You started talking about legitimate businesses, about stepping away, and I understood then that you would take everything 3 generations built and hand it to people who would dismantle it within a decade because they do not understand what it costs to build. So you decided to dismantle it yourself," Daejin said. "I decided to preserve it. By killing me. By replacing you," Seongmin said, "quickly, cleanly, and by ensuring that the replacement understood its obligations." A pause. "The blame was to fall on the security breach. And the security breach," his eyes moved to Nia briefly, "was always going to be attributed to the one variable that could not be vouched for." The roof was very quiet under the rain. Nia felt the words land in the group around her, felt the specific weight of them. The outside team had not simply been paid to kill Daejin. They had been given a narrative, a story to leave behind. A security failure traced back to an outsider with no verifiable past, no organizational loyalty, and 3 years of people who would readily confirm that she had always made them uneasy. Seong-min had spent 3 years building the case. Every time he laughed at her warnings, he was building it. Every time he redirected conversation away from her, he was building it. Every lieutenant who had dismissed her, every security check that hadn't included her, every dinner where she had been treated as furniture, all of it had been cultivated, slowly and deliberately, into a consensus that would survive him and bury her. She had not known the scope of it until this moment. She had understood she was disrespected. She had not understood she had been framed. Daejin turned to look at her. His face in the rain and the dark was complicated in ways she didn't have words for yet, and probably wouldn't for a long time. "Nia," he started. "Not now," she said, very quietly. "Not unkind. Later. There's more coming." Because there was. Because 11 minutes had become 7, and 3 cars had come through the outer gate, and the hatch behind them had just shuttered twice in quick succession, which meant someone below had found it and was testing the conduit brace. And because Seong-min, in the window of silence following his confession, had taken 2 steps backward toward the north edge of the roof. "Kellen," Nia said. "I see him," Kellen said, already moving. Seong-min stopped, looked at the two of them, at Kellen blocking the ladder access, at Nia between him and the hatch, at Daejin standing very still in the center of the roof with the rain turning the shoulders of his suit dark. He looked at his nephew's face and found nothing there that was going to help him. He reached into the pocket of his dinner jacket. Not for a phone. Kellen moved fast, faster than Nia expected, faster than Seong-min expected, and caught his wrist before whatever was in the pocket cleared the fabric. There was a brief, graceless struggle, the kind that has no technique in it, just one man's grip on another man's wrist, and 2 people putting their full weight into opposite directions. And then Kellen had the small automatic in his hand, and Seong-min was breathing hard for the first time. Doige stepped forward and took Seong-min by the arms, not gently. "Don't," Daejin said. "To-do. Not a prohibition against violence, a prohibition against anything unnecessary. Just hold him." Do held him. The hatch shuddered again. The conduit brace was bending. Nia looked at the estate grounds below. The 3 cars had parked near the main entrance and she could see movement. Multiple figures, more than the original assault team, spreading out around the building's perimeter. Not retreating, repositioning. They were not done. They were reorganizing for something larger. 7 minutes had become 4. "Park," she said. "He's coming," Park said. He was on the phone again, his voice down to a murmur. Then he looked up. "He's 3 minutes out. But he's saying the outer road is being watched. Someone posted on it after the cars came through." 3 minutes. With the outer road covered, the hatch blew open. Not the conduit failing. Someone had come through the roof access from a different point entirely, from the main building's roofline junction, which Nia had not had time to secure because she had not had eyes on it, because you could not cover everything with 11 people and no communications and no light. The first man through moved fast and low, and Kellen shot at him, and missed, and the figure went sideways into the shadow of the antenna housing, and Park dropped his phone and went to Kellen's position, and 2 more figures came over the roofline junction from the main building. And then from below, from the grounds, came the sound of approaching vehicles. Not the 3 that had entered through the gate, something else. Faster. Multiple engines, Park's second, coming in hard. But the outer road had people on it, which meant Park's second was coming in hot against opposition, which meant the sound of those engines was not rescue arriving, not yet. It was a fight arriving, happening somewhere she couldn't see, with an outcome she couldn't determine from this rooftop. Nia pulled Yuna and the kitchen staff behind the antenna housing, put herself at the corner. The 2 figures from the roofline junction had not yet resolved their position. They were being cautious, aware now that there were armed people on the roof, unwilling to move into open ground without knowing what they were moving into. She looked at Daejin. He was looking back at her. In the 6 years she had known this man, 3 years of courtship, 3 years of marriage, she had seen him in controlled environments, in comfortable environments, in environments specifically structured to reflect his authority back at him. She had seen him make decisions with the full support of an organization behind him, with advisors and security and the accumulated weight of his name doing the heavy work. She had never seen him like this, cornered, rain-soaked. His uncle in restraint 3 feet away, his security chief crouched behind him, his organization in the process of revealing itself as a thing that had been partially aimed at him this entire time. Just him. Just the man underneath everything she had married him for and then spent 3 years trying to find again. "Tell me what you need," he said. "Not what do we do or how do we get out of this. Not the questions of a man waiting to be saved. Tell me what you need." She looked at the figures near the antenna housing, at the open hatch behind them, at the roofline junction with its uncertain shadows, at the grounds below where the sound of engines was getting closer and louder and more chaotic. She looked at the man who had finally asked the right question, and she understood that the version of herself she had set aside when she married him, the version she had folded up carefully and put in a box because she wanted something different, wanted something quiet, wanted to just be a person who lived a life without this particular weight in it, was not going to be enough. What this moment required was the version she had been trying to retire. She was tired. Her feet hurt in the shoes she had worn to a dinner she had survived by margins that were much smaller than she was going to admit. There was something wrong with her left shoulder that had been wrong since she caught herself on the utility passage wall in the dark, and she had been not thinking about it for the last 40 minutes with a focused, practiced discipline. She was cold and soaked through, and she had not eaten since the 2 bites of dinner she managed before the lights went out. She was not ready for this. She was the only person here who was remotely capable of it. "Stay behind me," she said to Dajan, "and when I tell you move immediately, and you don't ask where." "Okay," he said, "just that. No qualification." She turned toward the antenna housing and the 2 figures in its shadow. And the last version of Nia Calder Ryu, who might have chosen a quieter path, stepped back into the cold and the rain and the dark, and became, again, entirely and without apology, the woman she had been before any of them had decided she was something less. She moved left first, not toward the figures in the shadow of the antenna housing, away from them, at an angle, drawing their attention and their positioning in the direction she chose rather than the direction they expected. This was the first principle of everything she had ever learned in the years before Dajan. You do not go where the threat is oriented. You go where it isn't, and you make the threat reorient, and in the half-second of reorientation, you find the opening that wasn't there before. The first figure came out of the antenna housing shadow, tracking her movement. Kellen shot twice. The first round missed. The second did not. The figure went down hard on the wet concrete and did not get up, and the sound of the shots in the open air above the estate was enormous. Not the contained, compressed sound of a weapon fired in an enclosed space, but a flat, percussive crack that rolled outward into the rain and the dark and announced to everyone on the property exactly where they were. So much for cover. "East ladder," Nia said immediately, already changing direction. "Now, all of you. Because the moment your position is announced, your position is finished. You move or you become a target at a fixed point, which is the same as being already dead." The east face of the garage roof had a maintenance ladder bolted to the exterior, a narrow, rust-edged descent to the estate's east courtyard, 12 feet down. Not elegant, but functional. She had noted it when they came up. She had noted it the way she noted everything, without intention, without plan. The way a person who has spent years in dangerous places trains their eyes to collect the emergency arithmetic of every room they enter. The second figure from the roofline junction moved to cut them off. Park was faster. She didn't see it happen. She was already moving the kitchen staff toward the east ladder, Una first, then the other 2, one hand each on their shoulders, directing them with a firmness that had nothing gentle in it, because gentleness cost seconds and seconds were not available. But she heard it, a brief, brutal exchange of movement and impact, and then Park's voice saying clear, with the flat economy of a man reporting a fact. She did not look back to check. She trusted the word. Dajan was behind her, close, doing exactly what she had told him, moving when she moved, not asking where. She could hear his breathing. It was controlled. Not perfectly controlled. Not the breathing of a man who was calm, but the breathing of a man who was managing himself with everything he had, which was what she needed from him right now, which was enough. Do had Seong-min. Both arms, from behind, and Seong-min was not fighting it anymore. He had gone still with the particular stillness of a man recalculating rather than resisting. And that stillness was in some ways more alarming than struggle would have been, because a man who stops struggling has not stopped planning. Kellen reached the east ladder first, looked over the edge. Clear below. Go, Nia said. He went down fast. She heard him land, heard him move, heard nothing alarming in the 3 seconds that followed. She sent the kitchen staff next, then Yuna, then the 2 lieutenants she had not spoken to directly since the dining room, but who had been, she noted, reliably present and reliably quiet. The kind of men who watched before they moved, which in this context was exactly right. She looked at the open hatch. The first figure Kellen had shot was down and still. The second was Parks. From below the hatch, from somewhere in the garage they had just evacuated, she could hear movement, multiple people, unhurried, which meant they had come through the west door somehow and were now in the garage and understood that their targets were on the roof and were either preparing to come up or preparing to cut off the ground exit. "Doe," she said. "Get him down." Doe maneuvered Seongmin toward the ladder with the no-nonsense efficiency of a man who had been managing difficult people in tight spaces for a professional lifetime. Seongmin went, slowly, but he went. Daejin put his hand on her arm briefly as he passed her toward the ladder, not restraining, not dramatic, just a touch, the kind that says, "I see you," without requiring an answer. She turned back to the hatch. Park was at her shoulder. How many in the garage? At least 3, possibly more. She looked at the hatch. It was open. If she left it open, they had an avenue behind them. If she went back and closed it, she bought time but spent it herself. "Go down," she told Park. "I'll stay. You're more useful below. Go." He held her gaze for 1 second. Then he went. She crossed back to the hatch, reached down into it, found the interior handle, pulled it shut. There was no way to lock it from above, but she took the section of metal conduit she had braced it with earlier and now wedged it differently, not through the handle, but at an angle against the hatch's outer frame, where the concrete lip would hold it against upward pressure. Not a lock. A delay. 20 seconds, maybe 30. She needed 30. She went to the east ladder and went down in the dark and the rain, her left shoulder sending a signal she ignored by naming it. That is pain. I know you are there. You do not change what I am doing. And she dropped the last 3 feet to the courtyard stone because her hands were wet and her grip failed and she landed badly, rolled, came up on one knee. Daejin was there immediately. "Are you fine?" She was not entirely fine. "Where's Kellen?" "Here." Kellen emerged from the shadow of the courtyard's east wall. Behind him, the group was assembled, more or less in the loose and slightly ragged configuration of 11 people who had been through something and were still processing whether it was over. It was not over. From the estate's front approach came the sound of engines. Close now. The vehicles Park's second had sent were either on the property or at the gate. She could hear another sound under the engines, voices, shouting, the specific compressed cacophony of a confrontation happening at the outer perimeter. "They're fighting at the gate," Park said. He had his phone to his ear, listening. His face was doing something complicated. "My second says there are more on the outer road than he expected. They're pinned." Pinned. Which meant no cavalry arriving in the next 60 seconds. Which meant the additional cars that had come through the gate, the ones she had watched from the rooftop, were now inside the property, and Park's backup was outside the property engaged at the perimeter, and between those two facts was a gap through which she and 11 other people needed to survive. She looked at the estate's east courtyard. It opened, through a low iron gate, onto the property's east garden, a long, formal space with hedges and gravel paths that connected, at its far end, to the estate's secondary structure, a smaller building that served as staff quarters, and more relevantly, as the location of the estate's emergency generator and its independent communications hub. The communications hub, which was separate from the cellular repeater on the garage roof, which ran on the emergency generator, which meant that if the generator was running, and if the attackers had not yet reached it or disabled it, there was a hardwired communication system still live inside the secondary building. "The staff quarters building," she said to Kellen. He followed her sightline. "Bayun had access," he said immediately. Bayun had access to the secondary utility panel and the gate code. The staff quarters building has its own independent access system, separate keycard, separate authorization list. She looked at Kellen. "Who is on that authorization list?" "Household staff. My 3 senior security officers." A pause. Daejin, you. Not Seongmin. Not Seongmin. He never... Kellen stopped. He never asked to be added. He always said the secondary building was beneath his... Because he didn't need access, she said. He had Byun. She was already moving toward the iron gate. If Byun hadn't reached the staff quarters building yet, the generator is still running and the communication system is live, which means we can reach someone outside this loop. Police? Outside security? Anyone. And Byun already reached it, Do said. She looked at him. Then we find another way. But we check first. Do did not argue. She got the iron gate open, key again, the universal key that was going to save her life at least twice tonight, and moved them through into the east garden. The gravel crunched under 12 sets of feet, and she winced at the sound because gravel was a terrible surface for a quiet approach, and there was nothing to be done about it. The garden was gravel and always had been. Another detail she had catalogued and never thought she would need to regret. They were 60 feet into the garden when she heard the car, not the engines from the front approach. This was a single vehicle, coming around the building's east face along the service road, moving slowly, which was more alarming than fast because fast meant searching and slow meant arriving, meant whoever was in it knew where they were going. Down, she said. 11 people hit the gravel with varying degrees of coordination, and she was already behind the nearest hedgerow, pulling Daijin with her, and the car's headlights swept the garden in a slow arc as it came around the building's corner. It stopped, 40 feet away. Engine idling. She could see through the hedge in fragments, the vehicle, a dark estate SUV, 2 occupants visible through the windshield, not moving, just sitting, waiting. She understood with a cold precision what this meant. They weren't searching, they were covering. Someone had correctly anticipated that the east garden was the most viable exit route from the east courtyard, and had positioned a vehicle to close that exit before the targets realized it was closed. They had done this, all of it, the coordinated power cut, the communication disruption, the simultaneous breach at multiple entry points, the coverage of obvious escape routes, with a level of operational detail that required not just inside information, but inside expertise. Someone had looked at this estate the way she looked at it. Someone had read its geometry and its vulnerabilities with professional eyes and built a plan around them. Byun, who had been on the property since morning, conducting a systems maintenance review. Byun, who had spent 11 months working for Seongmin before Daejin absorbed the operation, and who had spent every day at this estate since the merger collecting exactly this kind of information. She had 18 minutes from the moment they got into the roof before Park's backup arrived. She didn't know how long ago that was. She had stopped tracking it at some point in the descent, and she didn't have a watch, and her phone had died 15 minutes into this, and she was operating now on pure estimate. 8 minutes, maybe? Maybe 6. The car idled. She looked left and right along the hedgerow. The staff quarters building was still 60 feet beyond the vehicle's position, through the garden, past the car, to the secondary structure at the far end. Going through the garden meant crossing the car's sight lines. Going around meant adding 300 feet of exposure on the estate's open south face. Or, she looked at the hedge. It was dense, a formal boxwood hedge, 6 feet tall, maintained with the kind of precision that made it nearly opaque. Nearly. There was space at its base where the groundskeeper's trimming left a few inches of gap between the lowest branches and the gravel. She leaned close to Kellen's ear. The hedge runs parallel to the car's sight line for about 40 feet before it angles south. If we stay on the far side of it, low, we can reach the building's northeast corner without crossing the car's direct line of vision. Low, Kellen repeated, looking at the kitchen staff, at Yuna, at the lieutenants. All of them? All of them. Seongmin's not going to see... Do, she said, without raising her voice. Do, who had maintained his grip on Seongmin's arms throughout the garden crossing and the drop to the gravel, looked at her. Make sure he does, she said. Do nodded with a brevity that suggested this was one instruction difficulty following. They moved along the hedge. 12 people. Gravel. In the dark. With a vehicle 40 feet away and at least 3 other teams somewhere on the property and an unknown number of reinforcements that had come through the gate. It took 4 minutes. 4 minutes of controlled movement, of hands on shoulders, and whispered directives, and one terrible moment when one of the kitchen staff, a young man whose name Nia had never learned because she had never been important enough to the household's routine to warrant an introduction. Slipped on the wet gravel and went down with a sound that was not loud but was not nothing. The car's engine changed pitch, not moving, but revving slightly, the way an engine revs when a driver's foot moves toward the accelerator without fully engaging. They froze. 12 people, not breathing, pressed against the inside face of the boxwood hedge while the car's engine held that slightly elevated pitch, and the rain came down and the seconds went out one by one. Then the engine settled. A door opened, one occupant getting out. She heard footsteps on the gravel, moving away from their position toward the building's southeast corner, which meant one of two things. Either the occupant had heard the noise and was checking the far side of the building, or this was a routine communication check with another team member positioned there. Either way, it meant one occupant instead of two in the vehicle. She made the decision before she had fully finished making it. "Kellen," she breathed, gestured. He read her immediately. This was the first thing that had felt like genuine coordination between them all night. A look exchanged and an intention understood without translation. And she filed it away as something that had been possible all along if circumstances had ever demanded it. He moved. He came around the end of the hedge at the point where it was lowest. She had identified this during the approach, a section where the groundskeeper's trimming had been slightly less precise, and crossed the 15 feet to the vehicle in a low, fast movement that she tracked entirely by sound because she had turned to watch the southeast corner instead, watching for the occupant who had gotten out, ready to signal if the timing collapsed. It did not collapse. The vehicle's remaining occupant had approximately 2 seconds of awareness before Kellen dealt with the situation with an efficiency she chose not to specify in her memory because the details were not useful and the outcome was. The engine died. She moved the group forward, past the car, along the hedge's last 20 feet, and to the northeast corner of the staff quarters building. The exterior door was there, keycard access, a panel with a small green light that told her the building's independent power was still running. The generator was live. She pulled the keycard from her evening bag, the card she had been given 18 months ago along with the access codes. The card she had carried tonight not out of expectation, but out of the same habit that made her carry the estate keys, the same accumulation of precautionary details that had been building in her without conscious design for 3 years. The card reader beeped. The door released. She held it open. 11 people went through. She went through last, checked the exterior one final time, and shut the door behind her. The staff quarters building's interior was lit. Not brightly, the emergency generator ran the essential systems only. But the communications room was at the end of the main corridor and its panel lights were visible from the doorway, green and amber and one persistent red that meant a fault somewhere in the system, but not a total failure. "Park," she said. He was already moving toward the communications panel. She turned to take inventory of the room. Kellen, standing to her left with the focused attention of a man who had finally shed everything that was not directly useful. Do and Seongmin. Seongmin sitting now in a chair against the wall, not because Do had put him there with force, but because there was something in Seongmin that had, in the last 10 minutes, gone quiet in a way that was neither resolution nor defeat. Just the particular stillness of a man waiting to see which direction the remaining possibilities fell. The kitchen staff, seated on the floor along the interior wall, the young man who had slipped on the gravel holding his wrist with one hand. Probably not broken, the angle was wrong for a fracture, but she noted it to come back to. Yuna, standing near the door to the building's small kitchen, watching Nia with an expression that had shifted over the course of the night from fear into something more like study. And Daijin, standing in the center of the room. Rain-soaked, his dinner jacket gone. She didn't know when, somewhere in the descent or the garden. His shirt translucent with water, a cut along his jaw from something she hadn't seen happen. Looking at her. She looked back at him for exactly 1 second. 1 second was what she could afford. Park said, from the communications room. "I've got a signal. It's weak, but it's there. Who do I call?" "Chicago Field Office, Federal Organized Crime Division," she said. "Tell them you have a situation at this address with multiple casualties, an active assault team, and a material witness in custody willing to cooperate." She looked at Seongmin when she said the last part. "They'll move fast." Park looked at Daejin. Daejin looked at Seongmin. Seongmin looked at the floor. "Do it," Daejin said. Park made the call. While he was on it, Kellen came to stand beside Nia at the corridor's end, where she had a sight line on both the exterior door and the communications room simultaneously. He stood without speaking for a moment. Then he said, not looking at her, "I knew something was wrong in the early stages. Not the specifics, but I knew." Another pause. "I chose not to pursue it because Seungmin had been here longer than I had, and because—" He stopped. "Because I'd been saying something was wrong for 3 years," she said. "Yes. And it was easier to believe I was paranoid than to believe you'd missed something Seungmin was hiding." "Yes." She let that sit. "Kellen," she said eventually, "after tonight, if you still have a job, you should know that the reason you have it is not because I trust you yet. It's because you moved when it mattered and you didn't let your pride finish the job the assassins started." She looked at him. "That's a low bar, but it's the bar." He nodded. The nod of a man who understood he was not being forgiven, only accurately assessed, and who found that, under the circumstances, accurate assessment was more than he had earned. "I can live with that," he said. "Good." She turned back to the exterior door. "Because we still have 4 minutes, and there are people outside who don't know the phone call just happened." Outside, the sound of the engagement at the outer gate had changed. Less sustained, more intermittent, the pattern of a firefight that was resolving in one direction or another, and she did not know which direction, and not knowing was the part that lived in the chest like a stone. Then her entire body went cold. Because through the staff quarters building's narrow side window, the one that faced the estate's main courtyard and the approach from the primary structure, she saw the lights. Not outside lights. Interior lights. The estate's main power had come back on. All of it. Every room. The exterior floodlights. The security cameras. Bright and total, as though the last 40 minutes had simply been interrupted and were now resuming. She looked at this for 1/2 second. Then she said, "Everybody down? Now." The group went to the floor. She pressed against the wall beside the side window and looked out without putting her face in front of the glass, looking from an angle, using the reflection in the window's interior surface to see the courtyard without being visible from it. The main estate building's front doors were open. Standing in them was a man she had not seen before tonight. Tall, wearing a tactical vest over civilian clothes, looking at the secondary building with the calm, informed attention of someone who had been watching this entire operation from a distance and was now choosing, for the first time, to be visible. Behind him stood Byun, and beside Byun, and this was the thing that hit her like cold water in the sternum, the thing that rearranged several assumptions she had been operating on all night, stood one of Daejin's lieutenants, not Do. Not anyone who had followed her through the utility passage or up the ladder or across the garden. One of the 3 who had been seated at the dinner table and had not come with them. She had counted 11 survivors and moved with 11. The dinner table had held, including Daejin and Seungmin, 14 people. She had not, in the chaos of the darkness and the first movement, stopped to account for every individual, because you could not account for every individual when you were trying to keep the group moving, because accounting took time that the situation did not have. 3 people unaccounted for. She had assumed the worst, that they had not made it through the initial breach. She had not considered the alternative. She looked at the lieutenant standing beside Byun in the open doorway of the main building, and she looked at the tall man in the tactical vest who was looking directly at the secondary building as though he already knew exactly who was inside it and how many, and she understood that the call Park had just made to the federal field office had bought them something, but not as much time as she had thought. Because the man in the tactical vest was not reorganizing. He was waiting. The difference between those 2 things was everything. She turned. Daejin was on the floor near the communications room doorway, watching her face. He had learned, somewhere in the last 2 hours, to read her face the way she had spent 3 years reading his, for what was underneath the surface, for what the expression was managing. "What?" he said. "There's a commander," she said. "Outside. He's been running this from the perimeter and he just moved to the front." "How many with him?" "I can see 4. There are more I can't see." "He's waiting," Daejin said. Not a question. "Yes." "For what?" She looked at Seungmin. Seungmin was still in the chair, still with that careful internal stillness. But at the word commander, something had shifted in his posture. A micro-adjustment, barely visible, that she would not have caught if she had not been watching him as closely as she had been watching him all night. "Seong-min," she said. He looked at her. "There's a signal," she said. "Something you were supposed to send when you had control of the situation. Something that tells the commander outside that the operation succeeded and he can stand down or proceed to phase 2. She watched his face. "He's waiting for it." Seong-min said nothing. "And it hasn't come," she continued, "because the operation did not succeed. Because you're in a chair in the staff quarters building instead of standing over your nephew's body in the main hall." She moved closer. Not threatening. She was not in a position to threaten effectively, and she knew it, just close enough that the conversation became private. "He's been waiting for that signal, and the longer it doesn't come, the closer he gets to deciding that the absence of the signal is itself a signal." "That would be correct," Seong-min said, very quietly. "What happens when he decides the signal isn't coming?" A pause. "He finalizes the operation," Seong-min said, "whatever state it's in." "Meaning he comes in and kills everyone." Seong-min did not answer, which was its own answer. She stood up, looked at Kellen, at Park, who had appeared in the communications room doorway, at Do, who was looking at Seong-min with an expression that had moved beyond anger into something more elemental. "The federal response," she said to Park. "How long?" "They said 20 minutes from the time of the call. That was—" Park checked his phone. 6 minutes ago. 14 minutes. Outside, the man in the tactical vest had not moved, but his hand was at his radio. "He's deciding," Daejin said from the floor. His voice was steady in the way voices get steady when steadiness is a decision rather than a state, when it costs something and you pay it anyway. "Yes," she said. "What do we do?" She looked at the window, at the building's interior, at the door, the one solid, keycard-protected door between this group and the man with the radio and the 4 visible people behind him and the unknown number of invisible ones. She looked at the communications panel in the room behind Park, with its green and amber lights and its one persistent red fault indicator. She looked at Seong-min, and she thought about what she knew, not what she felt, what she knew. She knew the building's layout. She knew the exterior geometry. She knew the generator was running and the communication system was live and the federal response was 14 minutes out. She knew there was a commander who needed a signal and wasn't getting one. She knew there was a fault on the communications panel. She looked at the fault light. She crossed to Park and looked at the panel. The red fault indicator was on the system's emergency broadcast circuit, a secondary signal pathway that bypassed the primary communications channel and transmitted on a separate frequency. An emergency broadcast circuit that, when activated, transmitted to every law enforcement receiver within a 15-mile radius simultaneously. It was faulted because the system had not been tested in 9 months, and one of its relay components had degraded. She looked at the degraded relay component. It was a small board, socketed, replaceable. And the fault was not in the board itself but in its connection, which had loosened over 9 months of thermal cycling. She pressed the board firmly back into its socket. The red light went amber, then green. She looked at Park. "Activate the emergency broadcast." He reached for the switch, and that was when the staff quarters building's exterior door, the one she had locked with the key card, the one she had closed behind her, opened. Not forced, not broken. Opened with a key card. She had forgotten. Or rather, she had known and set it aside because there were only so many things you could hold at once. There was a third key card for this building. Not Kellen's, not hers. The estate facilities manager, Byun. He came through the door alone, which was either confidence or instruction, and in his right hand was a weapon, and in his left hand was a radio. And he looked at the 11 people in the corridor of the staff quarters building with the systematic, efficient gaze of a man completing an inventory. His eyes found Seong-min first. Some rapid exchange of information in that look. Seong-min's expression and Byun's expression and the 3 seconds in which both of them understood the current state of things. Then his eyes moved to Nia. He knew who she was. She could tell from the way he looked at her, not the way people who had underestimated her looked at her, not the furniture assessment gaze she had been receiving for 3 years, but the look of someone who had been briefed, who had been told that the variable in this operation was her, who had planned for her and still ended up here. "The broadcast switch," he said, looking at Park's hand near the panel. "Step away from it." Park looked at Nia. Byun raised the weapon. I won't ask a second time, he said. The corridor was very quiet. 14 minutes, she thought. 14 minutes, and this is over. 13.5 minutes now. Byun was between her and the exterior door, with a weapon at an angle that covered Park and herself simultaneously, and the kitchen staff were on the floor behind her, and Daejin was in the communications room doorway, and Kellen... She did not see Kellen. She had lost track of Kellen, which meant Kellen had moved without her seeing it, which meant either he was behind her somewhere and she had a problem, or he was somewhere other than behind her, and that somewhere was what she needed to find out without looking for it, because the moment she looked for it, Byun looked for it too. Put it down, Byun said. To Park. The radio. The phone. Everything. Park looked at Nia. She gave him a very small, very specific nod. Not agreement with Byun's instruction. Communication. Park understood. He had been in difficult rooms before, she could tell. Not rooms like this exactly, but rooms where a nod from the right person meant something different than what it appeared to mean. He lowered his hand from the broadcast switch. He did not activate it, but he did not step away from the panel. Byun came forward 2 steps. I heard you, Park said, keeping his voice flat and his body still, and his right hand, the one that wasn't near the panel, doing something at his side that Byun was not watching because Byun was watching the broadcast switch. Nia was watching Byun's feet, the way his weight was distributed, the way a man's body telegraphs, before his decision becomes conscious, which direction he is about to move. She was watching for the moment his weight shifted. It shifted at the same moment Kellen came out of the building's small kitchen doorway, the door that connected the corridor to the kitchen, the door that Yuna had been standing near when they first entered the building, the door that Kellen had, without her instruction, quietly positioned himself behind at some point in the last 3 minutes. Byun heard him. Not fast enough. The next 7 seconds were not clean. They were not the choreographed efficiency of a plan executed well. They were 7 seconds of noise and impact, and a weapon discharging into the corridor ceiling and plaster coming down and someone shouting, "Do!" from behind, and Nia moving into the space that Byun's stumble created with every intention of reaching the exterior door before he recovered. She did not reach it. He recovered faster than she accounted for, and his arm caught her left shoulder. The wrong shoulder, the one that had been wrong since the utility passage, and the pain of it was comprehensive and immediate, and she did not stop, but it slowed her, and in the slowing he got between her and the door. They were 3 feet apart. His weapon was on the floor. Kellen had it. She could see it in Kellen's hand at the edge of her vision. Byun looked at the weapon in Kellen's hand, looked at the radio in his own, looked at Nia, 3 feet, and in those 3 feet standing between her and the exterior door and the man with the radio. And the radio that reached the commander outside, and the commander who was waiting for a signal, she understood with absolute clarity that she was the only thing between this group and whatever Byun called in on that radio in the next 30 seconds. Daejin said her name from behind her, low, warning. She heard it. She kept her eyes on Byun. The broadcast went out, she said. Byun's expression shifted. Park activated it before you came through the door, she said. The federal response was already moving, 14 minutes from the time we called, and it's been... She did not have a watch. She had not had a watch for the entire night. She had been running on estimate and instinct and the arithmetic of seconds. It's been at least 12. It was a lie. Park had not activated the broadcast switch. Byun had arrived before Park moved his hand, and she did not know if Park had managed to activate it in the chaos of the last 7 seconds. And there was no way to know without looking, and she could not look. Byun was very still. You're guessing, he said. 2 minutes, she said. If I'm right, you have 2 minutes before this property is surrounded. If I'm wrong, you have the radio. She met his eyes, held them. Are you willing to bet everything on me being wrong? The corridor was silent except for the sound of the rain and someone behind her breathing hard and the faint, persistent hum of the emergency generator. Byun looked at the radio in his hand. He looked at her face. He was trying to read her. He had been briefed on her. She knew that now, could feel the specificity of his assessment. And in that briefing, he had received a particular version of her, the version that Seong-min had constructed over 3 years. The woman whose warnings were anxiety and whose presence was a liability and whose instincts were not to be taken seriously. He was trying to reconcile that version with the woman standing 3 feet from him in a torn evening dress with a ruined shoulder and no weapon, who had moved 11 people through a dark building and out of a situation that had been engineered specifically to be inescapable, and who was looking at him right now with a steadiness that was not the steadiness of someone who was guessing. His radio crackled. The commander outside, checking in. Bune's thumb moved toward the transmit button, and from outside, well, close, very close, close enough to feel in the floor under her feet, came the sound of vehicles, multiple vehicles, moving fast. Light swept the building's narrow side window, not the warm amber of the estate's exterior floods, not the headlights of civilian cars, but the cold, flat white sweep of tactical spotlights, the kind mounted on law enforcement vehicles, the kind that turned a dark property into a daylight crime scene in the space of one pass. Bune heard it. His thumb stopped on the radio. From outside came a voice, amplified, formal, carrying through the rain with the specific authority of an institution that had arrived with enough force to make the question of resistance a mathematical rather than emotional one. This is the FBI. All personnel on the property, put down your weapons and... The rest of the sentence went somewhere Nia did not process, because what she processed, in that moment, was Bune's face. The calculation completing, the window closing, the point at which a man looks at everything in front of him and understands that the version of this night he planned for is not the version that arrived. He looked at her. She looked back. 2 minutes, she said. Give or take. His hand lowered. The radio stayed in it, but his thumb moved away from the transmit button, and Kellen moved forward, and Doe moved forward from behind, and the situation resolved in the corridor of the staff quarters building with the particular inglorious practicality of situations that have been running on maximum tension for too long. Not with a final confrontation, not with a moment of decisive triumph, but with a man's hand lowering and a room full of people exhaling all at once. Outside, the lights continued their sweep. Outside, the voice continued its instruction. Outside, the estate that had been a closed system for the last 2 hours, sealed off, isolated, cut off from every resource that might have helped, was no longer closed. Nia stood in the corridor of the staff quarters building with her hand on the wall and her shoulder on fire, and the rain coming through the still open exterior door in cold horizontal sheets, and she did not feel triumph. She did not feel relief. She felt, with the precise and honest clarity of someone who has spent 2 hours operating at the edge of what a person can hold together, the very first sensation of the thing that comes after, the weight of it. The full accumulated weight of the night arriving all at once in the muscles and the bones and the chest, the way it always arrived, not during, never during, but the moment after, when the body understood that it was allowed to feel what it had been holding at arm's length. Her left hand was shaking. She pressed it against the wall and felt the vibration of the generator through the plaster, and breathed. In, out, in. Daejin appeared at her side. He did not touch her. He stood close enough that she could feel the heat of him even through the cold and the wet. And he did not say anything, because there was, right now, nothing to say that would not be smaller than the thing it was trying to address. From the main estate building, visible through the open door and the sweep of the tactical lights, she could see figures moving. Federal agents in tactical gear, spreading through the property with the systematic efficiency of people who had been briefed on approach and were now executing that brief. She could see the man in the tactical vest, the commander, Seongmin's commander, being approached by 2 agents at the main building's entrance. Could see his posture change. Could see the moment when a man who has been running an operation understands that the operation is no longer his to run. She could see Bune, now in Kellen's control, looking at the floor. She could see, through the communications room doorway, the green light on the emergency broadcast panel, steady and certain. Park had activated it. She did not know exactly when. Somewhere in the 7 seconds of chaos. She had said it was live when she didn't know if it was live, and it had been live, and the distinction between those two things, between what she said and what she knew, was something she was going to carry for a while, she thought. The specific discomfort of having gambled other people's lives on the accuracy of her own judgment. She was glad she had been right. She was not, in this moment, as certain as she had appeared to be that she would be. She had been right, but it had been close. Nia. She turned. Daejin was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not in 3 years of courtship, not in 3 years of marriage, not in any of the careful, managed interactions of the life they had been building together in a house that had never fully opened its doors to her. It was the expression of a man who was genuinely, completely, irreversibly seeing someone. Not what she could do. Not what she had survived. Not what she had saved or held together or refused to abandon, even when abandonment would have been entirely rational. Her. Just her. She looked at him. "I know," she said, and from the estate's main building, across the rain-soaked courtyard, through the open door and the sweep of the federal lights, came the sound of Seong-min's voice. Sharp, precise. The voice of a man who had spent a lifetime knowing when leverage was necessary, beginning, in the presence of the federal agents, to speak. Seong-min was talking. Everything was about to become very complicated in a different way. And Nia called her Ryu, standing in the doorway of the staff quarters building with her shoulder wrecked and her dress destroyed and 12 people behind her who were alive because she had refused, at every possible moment, to be what this night required her to be, looked out at the lights and the agents and the beginning of the aftermath. She breathed. She pushed herself off the wall. Seong-min talked for 4 hours and 17 minutes. Nia knew this because she watched the clock on the staff quarters building's communications panel from the moment the first federal agent crossed the threshold. A woman, mid-40s, with the particular unhurried authority of someone who had been in rooms like this before and had learned that urgency was less useful than precision. And she watched it until the sky outside the narrow windows began to shift from black to the specific dark blue that precedes dawn. 4 hours and 17 minutes of Seong-min's voice carrying through walls. She did not hear the specifics. She was in the building's small common room, which smelled of instant coffee and the particular institutional staleness of a space used by rotating shifts of people who never stayed long enough to make it theirs. She was sitting in a chair with her left arm in a temporary sling that one of the federal paramedics had fashioned from a compression bandage and a strip of nylon webbing. The shoulder was not broken. The paramedic had been confident about that, though he had also been confident that she should not use that arm for anything requiring force for the next 6 to 8 weeks, a timeline she had received with the polite acknowledgement of someone who intended to revisit it later. Around her, at various stages of exhaustion and medical assessment, were the people she had moved through this building. Yuna was asleep in the corner chair, her head dropped to one side, a thermal blanket from the federal response kit draped over her shoulders. The kitchen staff were being interviewed in rotating pairs by 2 agents she could see through the common room window. Park was on his phone. His own phone, his replacement phone, the one his second had brought when he finally breached the outer gate 40 minutes after the federal response arrived, speaking in a low, continuous murmur that she had stopped trying to parse an hour ago. Do was seated against the far wall with his forearms on his knees, looking at nothing. She had spoken to him once, briefly, and he had looked at her with the expression of a man who had just spent several hours watching everything he believed about the hierarchy of his world reveal itself as a thing that had been partially constructed around him without his knowledge, and who did not yet have the language for what that was. She did not push him. There was time. The paramedic had asked her 3 times whether she wanted something for the pain. She had said no each time, which was not stoicism or performance, but practical. She needed to be clear, needed to be able to assess everything she was seeing and hearing and being told with a mind that was not filtered through medication, because this part of the night was in some ways more dangerous than the previous part. The guns were quiet now. The knives in this room were bureaucratic and legal and would take longer to land but could cut just as deep if she was not paying attention. Daejin came back into the common room at 4:47 in the morning. He had been with the federal agents, being interviewed, being asked things, being the subject of a conversation she understood the shape of without being present for it, for 2 hours. She knew what they were asking. She knew the territory of the questions because the territory of the questions was the same territory as the entirety of their marriage. The organization, its operations, its history, its personnel, its finances, the precise cartography of 3 generations of a criminal enterprise that had structured itself around the business of survival and then confused that survival with legitimacy. He came in and sat down across from her, and for a moment they just looked at each other. He looked older than he had at dinner, not in the simple way that exhaustion ages a face, though that was there too. The hollows under his eyes, the cut along his jaw that had been cleaned and closed with 2 strips of medical tape. Something deeper. The look of a man who has had several foundational things removed in a single night and is now negotiating what the structure holds without them. They want me to cooperate fully, he said. I know. Everything. Not just Seong-min, not just the coup. The whole of it. He looked at his hands. Every agreement, every arrangement, every piece of the operation that my father built and I inherited, and he stopped. And never once questioned seriously enough, he said. She let that sit. There's a deal on the table, he said. Full cooperation in exchange for a structured agreement. Asset disclosure, organizational mapping, testimony against Seong-min and the outside team and everyone who was in the chain of command for tonight. He looked up. And a genuine dismantling, not a repositioning, not a reorganization into something that looks different but functions the same. An actual end. What does the deal require from you? Everything except my freedom, he said, conditional on full cooperation and a clean break. A pause. They're not being generous, they're being practical. They want the network more than they want me, and I'm the fastest way to the network. That's honest of them, she said. Yes. He looked at her. It's not a good deal, Nia. It's the only deal. She knew that. She had known it the moment Seong-min started talking, because the moment a man like Seong-min starts talking to federal agents, the landscape changes in ways that cannot be undone, and the only question becomes whether you're shaping the new landscape or being shaped by it. Take it, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Just like that, he said. It was always going to end, she said. Not unkind, not with satisfaction, just the simple, honest weight of a thing she had known and had not known how to say. In 3 years of evenings in this house, and careful dinners and conversations that always drifted toward somewhere safer. You knew that. I knew that. The only question was whether you chose the ending or the ending chose you. She looked at the window at the first faint alteration in the dark outside. At least this way you're choosing. He was quiet for a long time. Then, I should have listened to you 3 years ago. You should have listened to me 6 hours ago, she said. 3 years ago is a different conversation. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, too much weight on it for that, but the shape of one, the ghost of one. He said. She looked at him. At the man she had married because she had seen something in him that the rest of his world seemed specifically designed to prevent him from being, something quieter and more honest and more human than the role required. And she thought about what 3 years of not being listened to had cost her, not in dramatic terms, not in the language of wounds and grievances, but in the ordinary daily cost of a person who watches their own clarity and instinct be consistently discredited by the people closest to them. What that does. Over time. Not in a single devastating moment, but in the accumulation of small surrenders, small adjustments, the slow and steady erosion of the expectation that you will be taken seriously in your own home. I need to know something, she said. He waited. The moment in the dining room, when Seong-min laughed, when I told you we needed to leave and he laughed. She looked at him directly. You looked at me and you didn't say anything. And I need to know whether, in that moment, you didn't believe me or whether you believed me and chose the easier thing. The question sat between them. He did not look away from it. She had expected him to, had spent 3 years watching him look slightly away from the harder questions, find the angle from which they were less direct, find the answer that moved toward resolution, without requiring him to fully inhabit the difficulty. He did not do that. I believed you, he said. She absorbed this. I believed you and I didn't say anything because saying something meant choosing between you and them in front of all of them. And I had spent 3 years not making that choice because making it had consequences and not making it had none. He looked at his hands again. I told myself that your instincts were sometimes too sensitive. I told myself that Seong-min's experience outweighed your... He stopped. I was telling myself what was convenient, and I knew it, and I kept telling it anyway. She had wanted this admission for 3 years. She had imagined, in the various private inventories she had taken in this house while Dae-jin was elsewhere, and the rooms were quiet, and she was alone with the particular loneliness of a person who is present but not included. She had imagined that getting this admission would feel like something releasing, some pressure lifting, some account settling. What it actually felt like was grief, not anger, Not vindication. Grief. For the 3 years. For every dinner she had sat through performing composure over instincts she was not allowed to act on. For every conversation she had managed, and every warning she had softened, and every moment she had spent making herself smaller so that the room would be more comfortable for people who had already decided who she was. She had done that. Not because she was weak, because she had loved him, and love in the house of a man like Daejin Ryu required a particular kind of endurance, a patience that she had given freely, and that had been received as confirmation that she required nothing more. She sat with the grief for a moment. Then she said, "All right." He looked up. "All right," he said. "It happened," she said. "We're here. You know what you did, and I know what it cost, and the question now is not what we do about the last 3 years. The question is what we do about what comes next." "What do you want to do about what comes next?" It was the right question. She recognized it as the right question not because it was what she had been waiting to hear, though it was, but because of the way he asked it, without the slight managerial undertone that had lived in his voice when he spoke to her in the presence of others, without the performance of asking while already knowing the answer he preferred. Just the question, open-ended, hers to answer. She looked at the window. The sky was doing something now, the dark blue deepening into the first gray, the gray that comes before anything warmer, the sky before the sky. "I don't know yet," she said, "and I'm not going to know tonight." He nodded. "Okay. That's going to have to be enough for right now." "It is," he said. "It's enough." She believed him. Not completely. Complete belief was a thing she would rebuild slowly and on evidence, not on the emotion of a single night, however extreme, but partially. Enough to proceed. Enough to stand up from the chair and put her right hand briefly on the arm of the man who had finally, at extraordinary cost, learned to hear her. The federal agent appeared in the common room doorway. The woman, mid-40s, with the unhurried authority. She looked at Nia with an expression that contained a specific kind of professional respect, the respect of someone who had reviewed the night's events in whatever form they had been communicated and had made certain assessments about what those events required. "Mrs. Ryu," she said, "when you're ready, I'd like to speak with you directly." "Give me 10 minutes, Nia said. The agent nodded and withdrew. Nia stood, her left arm in the sling, her feet still in the heeled shoes she had worn to dinner, which had survived the night in increasingly deteriorated form and which she was going to remove at the first available opportunity and throw directly into a waste bin. Her dress was beyond any reasonable assessment of salvageability. She was cold in the specific way that comes from being wet for several hours in an insufficiently heated building, a cold that had settled into the bones. She looked at Daejin. "Take the deal," she said again. "One more time. Final." He looked at her. "Yes." She walked out of the common room. The corridor was busier now. More federal personnel, a forensics team that had arrived in the last hour and was moving through the building with the careful, systematic attention of people documenting rather than resolving, clipboards and cameras and evidence bags. She moved through them and they parted for her with a consideration that told her, without words, that the specifics of the night had been communicated between departments, and she had been placed in a particular category of person, not suspect, not victim in the conventional sense, something that required its own notation. She found the building's small bathroom at the corridor's end. She went in and shut the door and stood at the sink and looked at herself in the mirror. She did not look at herself often in this way, not as inventory, not as the practiced assessment of how she presented to rooms that had already decided what they were going to see. She looked at herself specifically with the same attention she had given to everything else all night. Her face was tired in a way that went past the surface. Her hair, which had been arranged with careful precision for a dinner that now felt like something that had happened to a different person in a different life, had come most of the way down, and what remained was approximately honest, the real shape of it, not the managed one. There was a bruise developing along her right cheekbone from a moment she could not precisely identify, somewhere in the rooftop chaos. Her left shoulder, even in the mirror's indirect evidence, the set of it, the way she was holding that side of her body, told the story of what the utility passage wall had done. She ran cold water and put her right hand under it, and then pressed it against the back of her neck. Just for a moment, just that. She thought about the woman she had been before all of this, before Daejin, before this house, before 3 years of being the person at the table that nobody addressed directly. Not the operational version of herself that had come back online tonight out of necessity, but the version between the woman who had simply wanted a quiet life and had believed, sincerely, that she had found one. That version was not coming back. She understood that now, not with sadness exactly, but with the clear-eyed recognition of a person who has looked directly at the thing they were avoiding and found that it was not as devastating as the avoidance had been. She had spent 3 years trying to be the woman this house would accept. She did not intend to spend the next 3 years doing the same thing. She turned off the water. She opened the door. The federal agent, her name was Reyes, Nia had registered it when she introduced herself at the beginning of the night, was waiting at a respectful distance, not precisely hovering but close enough to be available. She walked Nia to a small office at the building's far end that someone had established as an interview space. 2 chairs, a table, a recording device whose presence Reyes noted formally. "I'll need to ask you about the sequence of events," Reyes said, "from your initial observations at dinner through to the response team's arrival. Take your time. I'm not looking for a neat summary. I want as much detail as you can give me." Nia sat down. "My initial observations at dinner," she began, and her voice was level and precise and carried the particular quality of a person who has been paying attention all night and is now simply transcribing what was always there. "Began at approximately 6:42 p.m., when I noticed the exterior security camera behind the east window had stopped its active recording cycle and was showing a static signal. She talked for 2 hours and 3 minutes. She talked about the camera, she talked about the dogs. She talked about the reflection in the rain-dark window. She talked about every decision she made and why she made it, and what she was working from at each point. Not instinct, not the vague language of a woman who had a feeling, but operational reasoning derived from specific observable data that she was able to articulate clearly and in sequence because she had been watching clearly and in sequence from the moment the meal began. Reyes did not interrupt. She wrote steadily, and occasionally her expression shifted, not dramatically, but in small increments of recalibration, the adjustments of a person updating their assessment of something as they receive new information. At one point, Nia said, "The camera, the first thing I noticed. I've mentioned it to Daejin twice previously, not in a crisis context, just in conversation. I told him the camera was on the same circuit as the estate's primary security hub, and that if that circuit was accessible to outside interference, the entire system was potentially compromised from a single point." She looked at Reyes. "He told me I was overthinking it." Reyes wrote this down without comment. "I raised the possibility of an internal security vulnerability to Kellen Voss on 2 separate occasions over the past 18 months, Nia continued. "The first time he told me that my concerns would be noted. The second time he told me that the security protocols were reviewed quarterly and he was confident in their integrity." She paused. "He was not wrong about the quarterly reviews. The reviews were conducted by a team that included Bayun, who had authorized access to the systems being reviewed." Reyes looked up. "Bayun reviewed his own access points," she said. "Yes," Nia said. A silence. "Did you communicate this specific concern to anyone?" Reyes asked. "I communicated a general concern about the integrity of the review process to Daejin approximately 14 months ago," she said. "He told me that Seong-min had personally vouched for Byun's professionalism over more than a decade, and that he did not see a basis for questioning the arrangement." She held Reyes's gaze. "I did not pursue it further at that time." "Why not?" She looked at the recording device on the table. "Because I had learned," she said, "that pursuing concerns in that house required a particular kind of credibility that I was not considered to have, and that continuing to pursue them made me the problem rather than what I was pointing at." She looked at Reyes. "So I stopped, and I carried the concern without acting on it, and tonight that had consequences for every person who was in that dining room," Reyes wrote. "I'm not saying that to position myself," Nia said. "I'm saying it because it's accurate, and because if it's relevant to how you assess the events, you should have the complete picture." "I appreciate that," Reyes said. "It also means," Nia continued, "that when this is over, when the prosecution and the cooperation and the restructuring are all complete, I intend to do something about it, not personally, professionally." There needs to be a way for people who are in environments like that one to have their security concerns taken seriously without having to first establish the kind of credibility that those environments are specifically designed to deny them. She had not known she was going to say this until she said it. But as she said it, she recognized it as a thing she had been carrying for a long time. Not just since tonight, not just since Daejin, but since before. Since the years in private security overseas when she had watched the same dynamic operate in different contexts, the same systemic discrediting of certain voices, the same comfortable consensus that certain people's observations were anxiety rather than intelligence. She had survived that. She had tried to leave it behind. It had found her anyway. All right, she thought. All right. At 8:43 in the morning, Reyes concluded the interview, provided Nia with a card and a case number, and told her she would be in contact within the next 48 hours to review the preliminary statement. She was professional and thorough and showed Nia to the common room door with a respect that was genuine rather than procedural. Kellen was in the common room. He was alone. The kitchen staff had been transported. Yuna had been taken to a federal facility for additional interview and observation. The lieutenants were with their own legal representatives who had arrived in the early morning hours. Park had left 2 hours ago, his second driving. Doh was somewhere outside with agents. It was just Kellen, in a chair, with a paper cup of cold coffee that he had not drunk. He looked up when she came in. She sat down across from him. Not because she had a plan for this conversation, not because she had prepared for it, but because the conversation existed and avoiding it seemed like the wrong way to start whatever came next. "You're going to resign," she said. He looked at the cup. "Yes." "Why are you telling me instead of Daejin?" "Because Daejin already knows," Kellen said. "And because—" He stopped, reconsidered. "Because you're the one I owe it to." She looked at him. "Everything you told me," he said. "Every concern you raised. Every time you came to me with something, and I—" He stopped again. "I didn't dismiss it because I thought you were stupid. I dismissed it because taking it seriously meant admitting that someone I had written off as peripheral was seeing things I wasn't seeing, and I am a security professional, and that was—" He looked for the word. "Intolerable," he said. "So I made it your problem instead of mine." This was the most honest she had ever heard him be. She did not reward it with immediate absolution, because absolution was not what the situation required, and because Kellen, she suspected, would not respect absolution that came too easily. He was a man who operated in a world where things cost what they cost, and discounts were suspicious. "People almost died tonight because of that," she said. "I know. Some of them might have. We haven't had the full accounting from the outer gate yet." "I know." "Okay," she said. He looked up. "Okay," she said again. "You know what it cost. That's the beginning of something, not the end." She looked at him steadily. "What are you going to do after you resign?" He blinked, as though this was a question he had not expected to be asked. I haven't thought past the resignation." "Think past it," she said, "because someone who can do what you do, who also understands what happens when the wrong people are excluded from information, that's useful. That's something the world has a shortage of." She stood up. "When you figure out what comes next, you can reach me." She left him with the paper cup of cold coffee and walked down the corridor and out the staff quarters building's main door into the morning. The estate at dawn was something she had seen before. She had been an early riser for most of their marriage, had often walked the grounds before anyone else was moving, had learned the specific quality of morning light on the stone walkways and the east garden gravel and the main building's glass. She knew this dawn. She had seen dozens of iterations of it. She had never seen it like this. The grounds were marked now. Evidence tape, numbered placards, the systematic notations of a forensic process that would take days and whose conclusions would travel far beyond this property. The east garden gravel bore the impressions of the night, footprints, disturbed hedgerow, the arc of tires where the estate SUV had stopped and been abandoned. The main building's west exterior showed the mark of the garage door's forced entry attempt. The roof of the garage showed nothing visible from the ground, but she knew what was up there, and the knowledge of it was a weight she carried with her across the courtyard. She walked through the estate with her right arm at her side and her left in the sling, and the morning coming up gray and cool behind the tree line. And she looked at everything with the attention she had always given to everything in this place. And this time nobody was going to tell her she was overthinking it. Daejin found her at the East Garden's far end, near the iron gate she had unlocked in the dark 1,000 years ago. He came up beside her and stood for a moment not speaking, looking at the secondary building and the morning and the evidence of the night spread across the property. "It's done," he said. "I agreed to the terms." "Good. Full cooperation, full disclosure, the organization, everything it is now, the personnel, the finances, the operations, all of it, mapped and handed over." He paused. "It's going to take time, months, probably more, and there are people in the network who are going to—" He stopped. "Who are going to have things happen to them as a result." "Yes," she said. "That's what happens." He nodded. He did not argue with this and did not look for comfort in it, which was, she thought, the right response. A man who sought comfort in the consequences of his choices was a man who had not yet finished reckoning with them. "Seong-min," she said. "They have what they need from him, more than they need. Daejin exhaled through his nose. He was thorough. He told them everything, not just tonight, years of things I didn't know. He looked at the ground. Things about my father's operation that I had told myself stories about because the truth was, he found the word slowly, complicated. It was always complicated, she said. You just had people around you who were very good at making it feel simple. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that whatever your answer is, I accept it. I'm not asking to set up a particular response. I'm asking because I need to know." She waited. "Are we—" He started over. "Do you want to—" He stopped again. The careful, managed language was gone from him, and what he was left with was the unformatted version of the question, the one without the diplomatic phrasing that would have given her a comfortable out if she needed one. "Do you want to stay?" he said. "With me, and whatever this becomes. Do you want to be part of it?" She looked at the iron gate. She thought about the woman who had come through it in the dark 12 hours ago with 11 people behind her and a universe of uncertainty in front of her. She thought about what had been asked of her tonight and what she had given and whether the giving had been for him or for herself or for some combination of the two that she did not yet have clean language for. She thought about what she had said to Reyes, about what came next. She thought about the things she had felt in the corridor when the emergency broadcast light went green. Not triumph, not relief, but the recognition that she was still herself. That all of it, the 3 years and the dismissal and the careful management of her own instincts, had not taken that from her. She was still the person who could look at a dark room and see what others missed. She was still the person who could move 11 people through an impossible situation and bring them out the other side. Nobody had given her that. Nobody had taken it. It was just hers. "I'm not going to be the woman who sits at that table again," she said. "Not at any table in any configuration of whatever comes next." "I know," he said. "I'm not going to manage my concerns to make rooms comfortable. I'm not going to be peripheral. And I'm not going to have a marriage where my husband decides what I'm capable of based on what's convenient for him to believe." "I know," he said again. "Do you actually know? Or are you agreeing because tonight happened, and agreeing feels like the right thing to do right now?" He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and she was doing what she had done all night, reading the surface for what was underneath, looking for the managed version versus the real one, checking the alignment between the face and the fact. What she saw was a man who was tired in the same way she was tired, not from the physical events of the night, though those too, but from the longer exhaustion of having constructed a life around a version of himself that was easier than the true one, and having finally, at great cost, arrived at the end of that construction project. "I'm agreeing because tonight happened," he said, "and because tonight showed me things I should have been willing to see 3 years ago, and because I don't know yet how to be the husband I should have been all along." He looked at her without flinching. "I'm not pretending I know. I'm telling you I'm willing to try to learn, and I'm asking whether that's enough to start with." This was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise of perfection. It was a man at the beginning of something, at the real beginning, not the comfortable managed beginning they had had when they married, but the raw and uncertain beginning that requires 2 people to show up without the armor they usually wear. She thought about what beginning actually meant. Not absolution, not forgetting, not the slate cleaned of 3 years of small surrenders and swallowed warnings, and the specific loneliness of being present but not included. None of that disappeared. None of that was going to disappear because of one night, however extreme. But beginning did not require forgetting. It only required willingness. It's enough to start, she said. It's not enough on its own, but it's where you start. He nodded. They stood at the iron gate in the morning gray and did not touch, because what was between them right now was not a moment for touch. It was a moment for the specific honesty of two people who have been through something irreversible and are now standing at the edge of whatever comes after, and that is not a warm moment, not a soft moment, but it is a real one. The sun came up slowly, not dramatically. It did not break through clouds or flood the estate in sudden gold, the way it might in a different kind of story. It came up the way it always comes up, gradually, impersonally, with no particular interest in the humans beneath it, and the light it threw across the estate's grounds was the flat, functional light of early morning, the light that shows everything exactly as it is. In the days that followed, Nia stayed at the estate while the federal process moved through its initial phase. She stayed not because she lacked somewhere else to go, but because leaving felt, at this particular moment, like a different kind of running away, and she had made her decision about running. The kitchen worker whose name she had not known, the young man who had slipped on the gravel, was named Soo-jin. She learned this on the second day, when she found him in the main building's kitchen making coffee with his wrist wrapped, and she sat down at the kitchen table and asked him directly. He looked at her with the expression of someone who had not been asked directly about much in his employment at this estate, and told her. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing consequential, and she learned that he had been working at the estate for 7 months and had a sister in Michigan and had been studying landscape architecture before the financial circumstances of his family had required him to find immediate employment. She learned this because she asked. On the third day, she called a woman named Dr. Adaeze Obi, who had been her closest friend before Daijin, before Chicago, before the specific gravitational pull of a life that had slowly replaced its predecessor. They had not spoken in 14 months. The call lasted 3 hours, and Nia sat on the estate's south porch in a borrowed coat and talked. Not about what had happened, which was still an active federal process, and not something she could discuss in detail, but about what she was going to do. I want to build something, she told Adaeze, specifically for people whose warnings get ignored. Security consulting, risk assessment, starting with environments where certain people are systematically excluded from being taken seriously. She paused. I've been thinking about the structure for years. I just didn't know I was building it yet. You were always building it, Adaeze said. You were just building it in someone else's house. On the 5th day, Kellen called. He had resigned as of that morning. He asked if her offer, to reach out when he figured out what came next, was still open. She said it was. On the 7th day, Seongmin was formally charged. The federal filing was 31 pages and covered the conspiracy to commit murder, the financial machinations of a decade, the corruption of estate personnel, and the employment and direction of a professional outside team whose members were being processed separately. Seongmin's lawyer issued a statement that was careful and said very little. Seongmin himself said nothing publicly. She read the filing summary on her phone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and felt, at its conclusion, something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief but occupied the territory between them. Justice was not a clean feeling. She had known that before and she knew it now. It was procedural and slow and incomplete around its edges, and it would take time she did not intend to spend waiting for it. But it was moving. It was real. It was more than the alternative. On the 10th day, she drove into Chicago alone, borrowed the car, drove herself, did not ask permission and was not asked for it, and rented a small office space in a building on the near north side. Nothing extravagant. A room, a window, a table. The beginning of a footprint. She sat in the empty office for an hour and thought about what she was building. She thought about Yuna, who had been offered a temporary placement by federal services and had called 2 days ago asking whether Nia had any work available yet. She thought about Park, who had contacts she did not have. She thought about Kellen and the specific, hard-won knowledge that comes from being on the inside of a system and watching it fail. She thought about what that combination might build if it was built with intention and without the hierarchical furniture that had cluttered every room she had sat in for the last 3 years. She pulled out her phone and sent 3 messages. 1 to Yuna, 1 to Park, 1 to Kellen. Same message, all 3. When you're ready, come find me. I'll be here. On the 14th day after the night of the dinner party, Nia and Daejin walked through the main estate building for the first time since the night itself. The forensic teams had been and gone. The evidence tape was down. The estate was clean in the physical sense, cleaned professionally, restored to its previous order with a thoroughness that almost, but not quite, removed every trace of what had happened there. They walked through the dining room first. The table had been reset, dishes, glassware, the whole arrangement as it had been before the lights went out. Someone's idea of restoration. She looked at the chair she had sat in, the chair that was nearest to the window she had been watching, and she stood in front of it for a long moment. "We can sell it," Daejin said. "The estate, I've been thinking—" "I don't want to sell it," she said. He looked at her. "I don't want to run from this room," she said. "I sat in that chair for 3 years, and I kept what I knew to myself because I had learned to. And I don't want the last thing this room means to be that." She looked at him. "I want to come back to it when we've built something different and sit in it and have it mean something else." He looked at the table, at the place where the evening had assembled and been destroyed. "Okay," he said. They walked through the estate to the central hall, the room where, in the outline of the story this house was going to tell, the final confrontation had been imagined, where Seong-min had intended the narrative to culminate, where Nia Calder Ryu was supposed to have been a postscript. She stood in the center of it. The morning light came through the hall's high windows and lay flat and honest across the floor. Not golden, not cinematic, just light. She looked at every person who had sat at that table with her and laughed or been silent or looked away. They were not in this room. They were in federal facilities and legal offices, and the beginning of a reckoning that was going to be long and expensive and not entirely satisfying, because reckonings never were. She looked at Daejin. He was watching her with the same attention he had given her all week. A patient, consistent attention that was new in its consistency, that was still tentative, that had not yet become the habit it would need to become, but was trying in the way that things try when they are genuine. "Now do you see the truth?" she said. He did not flinch from the words, though she had not planned to say them that way. They had arrived with the weight of the night they had come from. The moment in the estate's wreckage, when she had asked the room, with exhaustion and with the weariness of the correctly underestimated, whether the truth was finally visible. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "The truth is bigger than what I can do," she said. "The truth is what they did to me because they assumed I could do nothing." She said it the way she had wanted to say it on the night itself, when there had been no time for the full weight of it. 3 years of that assumption, 3 years of being the variable that everyone could afford to ignore. And tonight that assumption nearly killed everyone in this building. "Yes," he said again. Not defending, not explaining. "I need you to understand," she said, "that when we build whatever comes next, that assumption cannot be the foundation of it. Not with me, not with anyone." She looked at him with the directness she had been refining all her life and exercising fully for 10 days. Because the people who are most likely to see what's wrong are always the people who are least likely to be asked. He was very still. "I understand," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had taken too long and paid too much, and who was standing in front of her without armor, without the managed version of himself, just the real and imperfect and finally present one. "Then we go forward," she said. He nodded. They walked toward the hall's far end, toward the open doors and the morning beyond them. Not a perfect morning, not a resolution that had healed everything overnight, but a real one, with real light and real ground under it, and 2 people walking into it with the full weight of what they carried and the intention, at least, to carry it honestly. At the threshold, Daejin paused. "I should have listened," he said. It was the simplest version of everything the night had cost. Everything the 3 years had cost. The whole accumulated weight of it in 5 words. She looked at the open doors, at the light, at the morning waiting past the threshold of a house that had not always let her belong to it, and that she intended, going forward, to inhabit without apology. "You should have listened," she said. She stepped through the doors. After a moment he followed, and the house behind them settled into the quiet of the aftermath, the particular silence of a place where something finished, where something that had been held for a long time was finally let go, and the morning received them both, ordinary and honest and without ceremony, the way mornings do.